Hi, my name's Dr. Vanessa Spiller. I'm a clinical psychologist and, more importantly, the parent to a young adult with FASD. I'm making this video today because there's a new resource I've pulled together, and it reflects the need for professionals like teachers, support workers, after school supporters, and it reflects their need to get accurate but concise information about our young people and their abilities, as well as the things that assist them. So I have constructed something that I call the Ability Wheel. And the idea of the Ability Wheel is it's finding a visual way of mapping our young people's abilities, where their strengths are, where their deficits are, and some of the strategies that are going to be most useful in assisting them, and trying to do that in a way that enables people like teachers to really quickly access things like classroom strategies and accommodations. First things first, though, a quick disclaimer. Please remember that all the information that I'm giving here today is general information. It doesn't take into account your individual child, so please don't hesitate to consult professional advice, obviously, about the needs of your particular child. So in turn, why did I put this together? Well, we were forever trying to talk to schools and talk to other people about our son and his abilities and the kind of things that were going to support him best. And what we found is that we had piles of information, probably like most parents. We had piles of reports and so much information, and quite often we would bundle that all up and we'd send it off to the school, hoping that someone would read it. In reality, I guess what I know is that, teachers in particular and school professionals are super busy, and they really are doing their best, and they can't possibly get through all of the information that we do send them, even though we'd really like them to. So I came to the conclusion that, what is it that schools really need? What do they really want? And what they really want is quick, accurate, easy to understand information. So if it's going to take them too long to digest that information, if they're going to have to search on like 10 different pages to get to the stuff that's important to them, many of them will probably give up and find that just too difficult. They also want a little bit of the background information, but in reality, they want to see where the rubber hits the road. They want strategies and suggestions that they can use with young people in the classroom. And they would really benefit from those strategies and suggestions that have already been tried and which parents may have lots of great information on in terms of what works and what doesn't work. So why did I pick a wheel? Well, I think a wheel is really visually engaging, and it's something that people are really familiar with. They're familiar with wheels in general and how wheels work. And I think it's a really nice way that we can apply things like the brain domains and brain functioning to a concept that's already pretty familiar to teachers. And there's a couple of unique qualities about wheels that is really applicable to FASD and to brain functioning in general. And one of the things that we know about wheels is that some of these basic ideas is that smaller wheels require more effort. And what I mean by that is, you go back to the picture of the tricycle, and the smaller wheels, what happens is that they require a lot of effort. So for our kids who have difficulties in certain areas of brain functioning, if their overall brain functioning wheel is smaller, even though they may have a whole lot of enthusiasm for learning, we know that learning and just overall functioning is going to require far more effort. Bigger wheels are going to cover more ground and they're going to require far less effort. The other thing we know about wheels is that smoother wheels run easier. So if you've ever had a flat tire, you know exactly what that's like. It doesn't run very smoothly. It's a very clunky and rough ride. And similarly with brain domains, if we have a really nice even spread of ability across our brain domains, it tends to mean that our life is going to run a little bit smoother. It won't require as much effort, and it will be just a smoother more even journey. Rougher wheels, or wheels that are misshaped or misaligned or have different areas of abilities in terms of strengths and weaknesses, by nature are going to be a rougher ride. And sometimes if you try to roll them quite literally as a wheel, they might not roll at all. They're going to need a whole lot of assistance to keep turning over, which again, when we think about our young people with FASD, is incredibly true of many of their experiences. So the ability wheel that I came up with is the one that's posted here. And what I have on the diagram is it shows the initial wheel that's on there would be for a fairly neurotypical young person who's performing in all the areas of brain functioning in the pretty average range. So you can see that it's quite a large wheel and it's quite smooth, which means that it will obviously require some effort to get through daily life. However, it is fairly smooth. And so with minimal assistance and with direction and general guidance that parents and teachers give to young people who have a wheel that looks like this are generally going to be able to move through life with a few obstacles and hurdles, but generally fairly smoothly. So let's start by having a look at our young people and your young person in particular. So where do you start? Well, step one is mapping your child's abilities. And again, many of us have a whole heap of reports, but probably more importantly, we have a whole heap of observations of our young people. We see them under lots of circumstances that nobody else sees them. So the first thing is to start to map your young person's ability based on these observations and based on any of the assessments that you've had done. And we're going to get you to observe and report on these abilities in the 11 brain domains. And the reason we've picked these brain domains is because these are the brain domains that are typically assessed when a young person is being assessed for FASD. And they're also the brain domains that are most commonly impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. So there's a whole lot of these brain domains, and this video isn't really dedicated to explaining what each of these brain domains is about. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but if you want more information about what the different domains are, and if you need some guidance in terms of how to pull these apart and to assistance to reflect on how your young person is going in these areas, then you can use the Explained by Brain book. So this is the FASD workbook for parents, carers and educators that I recently published, and it goes into great detail about each of those domains and your ways of reflecting, and gives you some tools for actually reflecting on how your young person goes in each of those domains. But coming back to the brain areas, the other thing that we do is we're going to look at the different ways of looking at how they're functioning in those areas. And so we're using colours to be a bit of a guide in terms of where your young person is performing. So you can see the red one, and that's indicating that a young person has severe impairment in that area. The orange zone is they're performing below average, so they have some significant difficulties, but they're not what we would classify as severely impaired. Now, a lot of the reports you'll get have this kind of language in them, so that can help you to determine whether your young person is average, below average, or has severe impairment, or in fact if they're above average in certain things. So we also include average performance, above average performance, and exceptional performance as well. Once we have a good understanding of the different brain areas of our young person and how they've been impacted, we can then use the ability wheel to start to map these areas. So for example, if we look at an area like attention, and then we know that our young person has been assessed with this, maybe they've got a diagnosis of ADHD, then we know that the young person has been found to have something like severe impairment in the area of attention. So we can put a dot, and we don't put it on the existing red dots, but we put it between there. So we start to create a circle that maps out young person's ability in different areas. If we get to an area, for example, like language, where a young person might have some differences. So it may be that their expressive language or their ability to talk and communicate is somewhere in the normal range, but their ability to understand or comprehend language, their receptive language is extremely poor, then what you can do is you can actually divide that wedge into two different parts, and you can put a dot for the expressive language that might reflect being in the average range or even the above average range, and you can use a dot in another part of the wedge that would indicate that they actually have severe impairment in receptive language or in their understanding of language. And you can break any of the wedges down into smaller areas. You just need to put a bit of a note to say you've done that. Another area that you might do that in is things like academic performance. So if you have a young person that is performing academically okay in things like reading and writing, but in maths is extremely impaired, then you could identify those deficiencies by just putting another dot there so that we can see where those are. So you can attack these domains either as a whole, or you can break them into subdomains, more domains. But remember, we're trying to communicate the main point, which is, basically how our young person is going in these different areas in a way that teachers are going to be able to understand. So I've done an example here. This is what we would call a neurotypical brain. So this might be the brain profile of a young person who is fairly well-rounded in their abilities. And so you can see that the circle that is formed is fairly uniform. We can see that there might be some slight deficiencies or some slight difficulties in affect and emotional regulation. So this might be a young person that has overall is doing pretty well, but does experience some anxiety. You can see that their motor skills are perhaps a little bit above average, so perhaps they're particularly talented in sports and things like that. But in general, their wheel is pretty round and it's pretty smooth. So when we're looking at that and how that then impacts on their functioning and how they do in their life, you can see that for this young person, it's typically going to be a much more smooth rolling wheel, which is not to say that their life will be perfect, but it's going to require less effort to go through the daily skills of life. And it's going to be a reasonably smooth ride. So let's have a look now at a young person with FASD. And of course, what we know is that every individual with FASD is a little bit different. So each profile of a young person with FASD is going to look a little bit different. So for this particular young person, let's have a look at their brain. And so you can see here that this young person has severe deficits in a number of areas. So they've got some severe difficulties in adaptive functioning, and in this case that's reflecting social skills but also some of those daily activities of living like self-care. Significant issues with executive functioning, so these are young people who find it very difficult and struggle with organisation, but also with impulsivity and being able to identify cause and effect and how those two things relate together. It's a young person that has severe impairment in affect and emotional regulation. So this might be a young person who's been diagnosed with something like depression or with anxiety. We can see that this young person has some severe impairments in attention. Again, this might reflect behavioural symptoms such as those found in ADHD. In regards to memory, memory is actually being divided in two. So for this young person, their visual memory is actually probably more in the normal range. They have a good capacity to be able to remember certain things that they've seen, but their memory for verbal things is much lower, and they'll often forget things that they're told verbally. Similarly, you can see some differences in their expressive and their receptive language. So they have slightly more abilities in terms of their expressive language, but their understanding of language is really poor. So you can do that for all of the different areas for your young person with FASD. Again, you can see that this young person has some strengths in motor skills, that their fine motor skills are still quite impaired, but their gross motor skills are relatively intact and in fact can be above average. So overall, what this profile tells us is we can have a look again, we have a look at the shape of that and how that's likely to impact on their everyday life. And the kind of questions we're going to ask is, how well would this wheel roll? And just looking at the shape of this young person's ability, we can see that it's not going to be an easy roll. Life is not going to run particularly smoothly, and it's likely to require a great deal of effort, not only from the young person, but from the people supporting the young person as well. If we have a look at both of those brain areas, if we look at those mapped one on top of the other, we can have a good guess at, which of these kids is likely to be more successful in school. And again, I think it's really easy to look from the visual diagram to be able to identify that the young person with FASD is really going to have a much tougher time of it, that their abilities are very varied, and that's going to have a really profound effect on their functioning at school, their functioning at home, their functioning in the playground, because their profile map travels with them everywhere. This is their profile map, whether they're at home or at school or in the community. And that's a really important thing for teachers in particular to be able to understand and to be able to get their head around in some meaningful way. Step 2, and this is the guts of it for lots of teachers and educators. What they want to know is, what do I do about this? Now, I understand that if this young person has a really varied and a lot of challenges in terms of their brain functioning and their abilities, what can I do about that? And so this is the step where we can start to map in and put in some key accommodations, so key ways that their environment can be changed, some key ways in which people's expectations can be changed, and some key ways in which interventions can be applied. So it's a great place to start putting in some accommodations and strategies. And parents are really well placed to do this. You know your young person. You know many of the strategies that work for you at home. You know many of the strategies that don't work so well for your young person at home. And these are not meant to be dictatorial and to tell teachers what to use and what strategies to use, but they're a good way of giving teachers a guide about key areas and key strategies and key accommodations that might make a really big difference for your young person. So if we look at this one again as an example, you can see that when it comes to things like executive functioning and affect and emotional regulation, so these are kids who are likely to be highly impulsive and to have really quick reactions. They may experience a whole lot of meltdowns. They may be really easily overwhelmed. We can see that supervision, especially during lunch times, is going to be really important. So supervising in general is important, but for these guys, it's super important that during those times when things are even more chaotic, when there's even more noise and there's even more distraction, and when the social rules and stuff are even more complicated, they're going to really benefit from having some good quality supervision. Other strategies might be things like, if we look at attention, so we have a young person who has something like ADHD, we may want to just double check that the young person's actually heard the instructions or comprehended the instructions. And they might be young people who need movement breaks every 15 minutes. So you can go through each of the domains, and you don't have to do it for each of the domains, but you may pick some really key ones, because again, we don't want to overwhelm teachers, but we do want to give them some really key strategies to be able to look at making a difference for young people in the classroom and in the playground and in any other activities that they're doing. Another thing that's really important here is, I think, that we recognize their strengths. So if you look at this young person, they really have some strengths in terms of their gross motor skills. And they're a young person that's physically really capable, which might mean that in those areas, so when they're in their physical education classes, that they maybe have a role in teaching other young people certain skills. Again, it would depend on the young person, but giving them a role that allows them to demonstrate particular skills can really be helpful. So we want to go around that circle and maybe just give some of these key strategies and accommodations that we think are going to be really helpful for our young person. If you're not sure of what strategies might be helpful, again, this is really common. There's a whole heap of strategies that are out there, and sometimes we're struggling a little bit to find something that works for our young people. But if you are looking for some more details around what kind of strategies might be helpful for a young person with FASD, you can again go to the Explain by Brain, the FASD workbook that's available from the Jumpstart Psychology website. And what you'll find for each of the brain domains, there's a whole range of strategies that may be helpful for your young person. And it does go through looking at different accommodations and changes that might be made to the environment, different kind of accommodations and changes that can be made to people's expectations, but also to how strategies and young people are approached or how these things are implemented. And you, of course, can add your own. You know your young person better than anyone else, so adding in your own strategies is a great idea. So step 3 is review these regularly and discuss these with teachers, childcare staff, and other support workers. So obviously, the more that you can work as a team with school staff, the more successful and the more likely teachers are to be implementing these strategies that are hopefully going to be helpful and make a difference to young people. So do review them regularly and discuss them. But I often suggest go in with some basics, go in with some that you happen to know work, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to put all the pressure on teachers and childcare staff to have all of the answers. I think if we can provide them with a really good base, then it gives them something to work from. And they'll also then be able to tell you, actually, we're going to find that really hard to implement in the school setting, but we might be able to do it like this. So talking about these things regularly can be really helpful. So if your young person has an individual support plan or an individual education plan or one of those kind of things, and this is like a one-page summary that can be included in that. So if you found this useful and you would like a copy of the Ability Wheel, I'm really happy to share it with you, and you can get that from my website, which is www.jumpstartpsychology.com. You just need to go to the Explain by Brain page, or you can go to the FASD resource page, and you can download a free copy of the Ability Wheel. The only thing that I ask is you just acknowledge where you got it from. The other thing, I guess, that would be really helpful is if you have any feedback from me or anything that you think would make the Ability Wheel better, that would improve it. I would love to hear your feedback. So the best way to send me some feedback is to just email me. Sometimes you'll find me hanging around on lots of the parent groups online. If you see me in there, by all means, get in contact and let me know what you think and what might improve it. If you're looking for, I guess, even more information, I want to do more of a deep dive into things like strategies, reflections, trying to understand your young person and what's going on in their brain, you can buy the Explain by Brain Parent Workbook. Again, that's available from my website, and it runs through some background information on FASD. It gives real-world examples. It runs through common scenarios and behavioural symptoms that many young people with FASD face. So it's got a truckload of information in there. It runs through the brain domains and answers a whole lot of really common questions that parents and carers and educators have about FASD. So if you want to do a bit of a deep dive and immerse yourself in a whole lot more information and a whole lot more strategies and resources, the Explained by Brain workbook is probably the way to go. And it's a digital download, so you don't have to worry about postage, especially posting from Australia. So you can just download it and it'll instantly go to you. So these are my contact details. As I said, please get in contact. Let me know what you think. Give me some feedback on what you like and what you don't like. And I love making these resources, so please let me know any of those things, and I will most probably try to incorporate it into a newer version. Thanks for listening, and I hope you really enjoy it and get a lot of use out of it.